professor, writer, thinker, all kinds of there's all kinds of titles I could put on his name. Sociologist. He is a fellow at Darwin College at the University of Cambridge. Full time. I think the term they use over there is lecturer, but that doesn't mean in England what it means here. He's a full professor. So this is really really exciting to have you here, Thomas, joining us from across the pond, as they say. So before we get into all the different projects that you've got going on right now, can you give us a little background to your story? Give us a little bit of a taste of your educational journey. How you got how you
Sure, yeah. So first of all, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be part of this most impressive series. I haven't got to see enough of it, just because my partner just had our second child 3 weeks
congratulations.
ago. So I've been quite had my hands quite full. But nonetheless, I've tried to take a peek, and it's just amazing your productivity in this crazy time we're in. So you ask about my background. I come from Southern California. My a second generation Californian. My father was actually born at the Naval Hospital down in San Diego um, back in 1947. So not too many of the waspy Californians can go back so far. Um, my parents grew up in Monrovia, up in Los Angeles, and I grew up close to Long Beach in a place called Cypress, which is right on the border between LA County and Orange County. Um, I went to Catholic school. My family's Catholic family, so I went to Catholic school. Catholic for 12 years, basically. Went to a high school in Anaheim called Servite High School, which is an all boys Catholic school. Pretty traumatic experience in many ways. But I developed a kind of critique of. I was exposed. I was exposed in the Catholic schools to a kind of Catholic critique of capitalism, left wing Catholic type of thought. Pretty early on, became very interested in that kind of exposed to liberation theology and that kind of stuff through a few of the teachers in my high school, in particular. Then went to UCLA for my undergraduate education, where I studied political theory, and there's where I was exposed to Marxism. Particularly, had two professors that were really influential to me. So it was interesting. Kind of went from this kind of left wing Catholic critique into exposure to Marxism, and I was very open to that kind of radical critique of capitalist society. Two of the professors, a guy Victor Wolfenstein, who was a psychoanalytic Marxist. I took a class on Malcolm X and the Black Revolution. And I guess that was in 1994. I took that class. At the same time, I also took a class on Marx and Marxism by this guy named Richard Ashcraft, who is a political theorist famous for writing about John Locke, John Stuart Mill, and these sorts of people. But he did this kind of Marxist history of ideas, which I was really interested in. Um, Other formative experiences, my dad was very insistent on me going to public school for college. I wanted to go to Notre Dame, so he saved me from that actually. And part of the reason why he was very insistent was because he thought the UCs had a really good education abroad program. So I had the opportunity to study abroad my junior year in college. I went to Barcelona, and that was just rocked my world. I'd never really spent very much time outside of Southern California before. This was 1993, 1994, that school year, and just the exposure to the in many ways, for me at the time, it was a radically different kind of urban environment. Learning the languages, because I learned both the Spanish and the Catalan language that year. I had spoke some Spanish before. I had to learn Spanish to get into the program, but definitely with respect to fluency and things like that, it made a big difference. Just really very much changed my existential horizons. I was sort of on a track to become a lawyer. I always thought I was going to be a lawyer. If I started studying political science, thinking I was going to go to law school. But after spending that year in Barcelona, I was uh, very interested in spending more time abroad and figuring out ways that I could continue traveling and go and being in school and doing these sorts of stuff rather than end up going to law school and then being a corporate lawyer or something like this. That was sort of not an option anymore after that formative year. Um, so I ended up after I finished my undergraduate education, I ended up spending another year in Barcelona. I went back to Barcelona. I taught English there for a while I applied for graduate schools. I thought I was going to go to Berkeley. I got into Yale, and so I ended up going to Yale instead. And at Yale, I studied political theory. The radical democratic political theory was I consider myself. It became very obvious to me my first year at Yale that it was very difficult to be a Marxist at Yale. So I kind of was still a Marxist, but I kind of rechristened myself a radical Democrat, and I studied with a bunch of kind of left leaning liberal democratic theorists, and I had the opportunity to study with a Spanish guy named Juan Lins, who had written a lot on the Spanish, the transition to democracy, on the Franco regime and the legacy of the Franco regime, on fascism, comparative fascisms, on nationalisms in Spain. And because I was very interested in spending more time in Spain, I loved it in Spain and in Catalonia, I sort of hatched the plan to write a dissertation on language politics and nationalist conflict in Spain, which I ended up doing. And from there, I got a postdoc in Madrid at this place called the Centro de Estudios Políticos y Constitucionales, the Center for Political and Constitutional Studies, and was gearing up to stay in Spain. I really didn't want to go back to the States. I loved it in Spain still. And that was a 3-year postdoc. At the end of that, I was trying to weigh up my options. There was a American university in Madrid that I'd been teaching at while I was doing my postdoc, called St. Louis University in Madrid. But I got an opportunity to come here to Cambridge, and this was in 2009. It was originally a 1-year contract. I ended up in Cambridge, and I'm here now. Close to 11 years later, I'm still here. So, yeah, in Blighty, as they call it.
That's quite a journey. Hey, so can you tell us a little bit about the difficulties? I want to get into the bulk of your work, but the couple things you said piqued my curiosity. Can you tell us why it's so difficult to be a Marxist at Yale?
Well, it was difficult to be a Marxist at Yale because Yale was a bastion of establishment thinking. At UCLA, I thought it was very. I mean, I was exposed to these radical professors, and so that was and it was just a amazing educational experience. And these guys were guys who they were products of the '60s. They'd been around since the 60s. They were 60s radical students who managed to make it into the academy and got tenure in the academy. And this was sort of a product of the milieu and the radicalism on the campuses in the 60s. And it's kind of a space that was won when both of those guys both Ashcraft and Wolfenstein ended up dying young, relatively young. And when they died, they were Ashcraft died in the early 90s or mid 90s, and he was replaced by a very mainstream kind of political scientist, a liberal political scientist, so to speak. Same thing with Wolfenstein. So those are spaces that open up as a result of political struggles and the climates on campuses associated with political struggles, and then they close off again. And Yale was just a space. In the history department at Yale, there were a few Marxists around, or at least radical anti-capitalist people. There was one guy, Jim Scott, who was at Yale, was an anarchist theorist. He was not around though when the 2 years that I was taking courses, so I didn't get to meet him until actually later. But in general, it's Yale is just it's very much an establishment place, and so the battle for ideas isn't really just a battle that's won because of the cogency of ideas, but it's a political battle. And Marxism was just deemed to be. I came with all my Marxist arguments and had a real hard time in the courses, and realized. Yeah, if I wanted to continue forward, I'd have to sort of meet some kind of common ground. So I was interested in democratic theory and kind of had an interpretation of Marx as a radical Democrat. So I managed to kind of use esoteric sort of language in the dissertation and in a lot of the coursework that was really exploring the themes of radical participatory democracy and these sorts of things, which for me was always consistent with Marxism, but also even here at Cambridge as well. The number one question that people were asking, I had privy to some information with respect to like the debates around the time I was hired for the permanent post here was, is this guy a Marxist? And fortunately, I had good credentials coming out of Yale that people were saying, well, no, I don't think he's a Marxist. I was look at the people he studied with; these people aren't Marxists. This, that, the other. So that meant that I was safe. Once I ended up with a permanent post, it became easier. It's also part of the times around 2000, with the crisis in 2008, it became easier to declare yourself a Marxist. So I kind of I became much more open about my Marxism after I had effectively a tenured position. So I was sort of a closet Marxist for many years.
That's kind of funny.
Yeah.
So when you say radical Democrat, so for our audience who might not be familiar, who would be some of the people that would have been palatable to Yale and also palatable to your conscience? Was like the Thomas Paine or something, or what was that?
Well, at Yale, there was a political theorist by the name of Ian Shapiro, who was had written very much a kind of a democratic critique. He had been Marxist in his youth, and had kind of somehow evolved into a liberal of some sorts. But he nevertheless had a kind of democratic critique of hierarchies, particularly capitalist hierarchy, but also other forms of hierarchy. So he was someone who Richard Ashcroft had been close with. Richard Ashcroft, the Marxist professor, and he had actually encouraged me to go study with him. So there was also at Yale there was a really famous, probably the most famous democratic theorist of the 20th century, who had been a Yale guy, this guy named Robert Dahl, who had written, among other things, he was in some respects he was very much a cold warrior, but in other ways he was an interesting thinker. He wrote, he had a critique. He had basically had a line of argument that said that if you believe in what he called polyarchy, which is kind of liberal democracy, democratic rules of governance at the level of the state, then the same arguments that justify kind of liberal democracy also apply to the capitalist firm. That in the economic sphere, he wrote a book called Preface to Economic Democracy, and and he says so that was the first part of his argument, was that if you believe in democratic institutions at the level of the state, then you should also believe in them at the level of the economy. And if you don't believe in them at the level of the economy, then you can't really justify the believing in the level of the state. So that you had to be a consistent Democrat, a Democrat with respect to all kinds of different social relations. So a kind of expanding the democratic ideal along. That's one kind of line of economic democracy, which you can consider to be radical democracy. There's people closer to the anarchist tradition too. People like Murray Bookchin who've made that kind of line of argument. And then there's also an influential strain of democratic theory, which is considered to be participatory democratic theory, and also deliberative democratic theory, that talking about the importance of democratic participation and trying to expand the sphere of democratic decision making, not only to the economic sphere, but also to all sorts of institutions. So the basic idea that people only learn how to govern by actually exercising democratic governance, and that that we need to be trying to implement democracy in all spheres of life, and to limit democracy to this voting thing that happens every 4 years is really doesn't live up to the kind of the reasons why the term democracy tends to appeal to people, has to do with the promise of actual self-determination, and that self-determination should extend to all spheres of life. So that was the kind of lines of arguments that were palatable, whereas historical materialism and reference directly to Marx was less less so. But nonetheless, in Marxist body of work, you certainly get that kind of radical critique of the exploitation and oppression in capitalist society, which has implicit in it is a radical democratic vision of a transcendence of capitalism. So, yeah, I don't know if that got a little too
are we talking about? So we're talking
scholastic there for you.
No, it's fine. Oftentimes, I mean, kind of the term that was kind of thrown around a lot. I remember over the past decade, maybe, is this concept of workplace democracy. Is that kind of what we're talking about?
Yeah, that's the economic democracy, is democracy in the firm and the workplace, but also democracy at the university, democracy in what's conceived of as civil society and institutions of so-called civil society, democracy as a set of ideals. Basically, the core intuition behind democratic principles is that if in a collective decision, and we're embedded in collective decisions all the time, including the decision not to allow there to be collective decision, that if your life is affected, your life prospects, your life chances, your quality of life is affected by a collective decision, then a fortiori you have a right to have a say in that decision-making process. That basic intuition, people call that the principle of affected interests. If you apply that principle of affected interests to society generally, what you end up getting is an imperative for kind of democratic empowerment, that goes much wider than how democracy is defined in the liberal democracies as this electoral circus that happens every 4 years.
Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about? Okay, so that's kind of like covering, kind of your work, your interests, getting into Cambridge. So tell us, what was it like? I mean, what was it like? I mean, you come from, just a regular Southern California life or whatever, and now you're teaching at like one of the three most prestigious universities in the world. I mean, that must be kind of weird, right?
In some respects, it was originally intimidating. I mean, it had been my family, both my parents grew up pretty much working class families, and my father was the first person in his family to ever get a college degree. He went through ROTC program, was a military guy, and then for them, well, the way that they kind of conceived of as success and aspirations was, if you know, could be a lawyer or a doctor. That's how I was on that path to become a lawyer, so to speak. And when I got into UCLA, they were very already. They sent me to Servite, which I mentioned, which was one of the highest ranking prep schools in California, and I had to perform quite well in the academic program there, and they were always be sort of beyond their expectations. When I got into UCLA, which public school, and at the time it was really a public school, it was affordable. One of the reasons why my dad wanted me to go there. But it was also an elite institution in many ways. They were very much very impressed by that, but there was definitely before and after with respect to my status in the family. I was the younger brother, the youngest actually with respect to the broader family. I was the youngest in the of all the cousins as well, and I always had to fight to get a word in. Had a hard time getting respected in arguments. We'd always argue about politics, about religion, politics, about all the things you're not supposed to argue about. We love to argue about all those sorts of things. And there was definitely a before and after with respect to my status in these family arguments. And that was the day I got into Yale. As soon as I got into Yale, there was this mystical cloud around me that somehow is associated with this elite institution. So my arguments, which were always the same arguments, they sort of had a different kind of weight once I was associated with this elite institution. As that mysticism, sir, I haven't managed to really break away from these elite institutions since. Although, I mean, I spent time in Madrid in a postdoc. But so being at Cambridge was very much reminiscent in many respects of my experience at Yale, only that Cambridge has, on top of the elitism, it has a real feudal mysticism associated with it, because this is an institution that goes out back 800 years and is very deeply implicated in the British ruling class for centuries. And with the college system, you came and visited me once, so you experienced it a little bit. It's in many respects a very reactionary place. But very elitist. I have, I guess, psychologically, the way that I operate is I'm particularly when I was younger, I'm very cocky, and so just took it as a challenge, and have been a thorn in the side of a lot of people here for a while. I mean, in many ways, it's an uncomfortable place to be. It's not a place that I never grew up wanting to live in England, much less be around Cambridge. But it's a place that it does offer in terms of career opportunities. Being associated with these elite institutions, people pay attention to what you say. And it's not because of who I am, but it's not a very legitimate thing, but it is just a reality that it opens doors for you.
Yeah. So let's talk about who you are. Let's talk about the projects you're doing. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about there's two major ones I really want to get into that I'm aware of, and if there's something else you want to share, there's definitely open to hearing about something new. But the two I want to talk about are the Mafari project, as well as the edited collection that you came out with recently. But let's start with Mafari. Tell us about what that was.
Well, Mathari actually grows out of the work that I was doing with respect to the Kurdish freedom movement. So maybe we do it the other way around.
Let's start with Kurdish.
We do it the other way around. So when I came to Cambridge, I was hired as an expert on Spanish politics, on questions of nationalism, but with a focus on Spain. I wrote this very long dissertation on Spanish struggle for self-determination in the Spanish context. So talked a lot about the Catalan context, where I'd lived for many years, as I mentioned. But one of the things that happens when you're at a place like Cambridge and you teach political sociology at Cambridge is people want to come and study with you because you're at Cambridge, because they want to study at Cambridge. And I was for now. There's a couple other people who also teach political sociology, but for several years when I was first here, I was the only person in Cambridge who taught political sociology. So I had a focus on the self-determination struggle. So I managed to get a cohort of really good graduate students who were interested in all kinds of self-determination struggles. So I had someone from Northern Ireland who came work on the Northern Irish case. I have someone from Cyprus and as well. Not Cyprus where I grew up, but Cyprus, the island. Um, uh, and uh, and also among them, I had a student who came to work with me by the name of Dilar Diritz, who's a Kurdish woman. And she got me very interested in the Kurdish movement. She wrote a dissertation on the role of the women in the Kurdish movement, and she came to study with me in 2011. So this was right as the civil war was breaking out in Syria, and all the events in Rojava began to unfold. And she ended up actually with a couple of other people, with some other people in the from the Kurdish diaspora, organizing an academic delegation to go to Rojava. This was in December of 2014. I went with my partner. Actually, we both went. She's an epidemiologist. She was part of this academic delegation. So I had the chance to be in Syria, to be in Rojava in December of 2014. This was when the siege by ISIS on Kobane was still going on. And from that experience, which was really interesting, to me, it was in many ways, it was the first time I'd been, as I said, around. I was an academic Marxist, or sort of a radical Democrat, or whatever you want to call me. But I was very much, from suburban California, and just had been around university circles and Barcelona, Madrid, these sorts of places. To be thrown into the center of this kind of revolutionary struggle, to see a revolution, not just read about it as something that happened somewhere far away, was really a transformative experience. So I ended up writing quite a bit about that experience, about the experiment in radical democracy. And that's one of the interesting things about the Kurdish revolution, is that they articulate, very much influenced by the ideas of Abdullah Öcalan, who himself was influenced by, among other people, Murray Bookchin, who's one of these radical Democrats I was telling you about. Conceiving of their revolution as a revolution of democracy against the state, a rearticulation of self-determination. Really fascinating. The role of the women, as my student Dilar emphasizes, is very important. It's played an important role in images of the revolution, these sorts of things. Anyhow, I got interested in that as kind of embedded academic through these delegations. After that, I got on the radar of the Kurdish movement, and the Kurdish movement engaged with me to get me to kind of use my privilege as someone around the University of Cambridge to be involved in multiple delegations. I've been involved in multiple delegations going into Turkey to witness as the peace process was breaking down in Turkey, to lobby in the European institutions in favor of the Kurdish movement, these sorts of things, and always writing about my experiences involved in this Kurdish struggle. So I became much more much more committed with respect to activist kind of role, to exercise my privilege in a way to try to affect some kind of sort of social change in favor of the brutal oppression against the brutal, in favor of attempts to defend the Kurds against the brutal oppression, the repression, the legal repression in the the European sphere, in the UK as well, to try to fight for the Kurds. Be a voice. There are a variety of different people involved in it. Be part of this Kurdish struggle, and so this has always been since 2014. It's been something I've been very much involved in. That led me to in 2018. It was to come up to Mathare. My wife is.
Before
Yeah,
we get,
you want to?
yeah, I want to
Yeah,
ask. So, like, I want to talk about Mafari and the work there and its connection to the other work you're doing. But it's very interesting that you mentioned that you're saying like use your privilege as a member, somebody at Cambridge, use your the power and prestige that brings to you as somebody there. Now, one thing I was really interested in was while I was at Cambridge was hearing um, a lot of the students there talk about just how powerless they were, right? Like I'm so powerless, I can't do this, I can't do that. What can I do? I'm the victim here, kind of stuff. It's kind of weird. Um,
yeah.
I mean, not so much I'm the victim here. Because we're all, stuff is relative. But there was this weird kind of idea that they not know that they are students of Cambridge, and like that as students of Cambridge that means something to the world. I mean, are they unaware of that, or
Yeah. I mean, there. Let's put it this way. There, I mean, Cambridge is a really, as I say, in many respects, a very reactionary place. And for people who don't come from uh, uh, British ruling class families, it can be very oppressive, experienced as such. And I think there's a general problem with respect to campus politics, where the campus is the universe that the people live in, and there are real issues with respect to injustices and oppression that happen to people who come from different backgrounds. But that can sometimes obscure the ways in which the university, and particularly a university like this, is an elite institution. Everyone associated with it has tremendous amount of privilege. So that's always a source of some sort of tension with students, with some of the activism on campus. There's a lot of really great activism on campus around. In particular, there's a lot of mobilization around the divestment movement, divest from fossil fuels movement, what have you. But there is also a variety of different social justice campaigns that are laudable, but it's very difficult to get to break down the kind of town gown divide and the really very deeply embedded and normalized level of elitism that is anyone associated with it kind of imbues this sort of sense of is embedded in such assumptions about desert and deservingness that it can be a bit shocking, in fact, to an outsider. So for you, for example, that was something that you saw very clearly, that people were kind of forgetting the fact that everyone at Cambridge is in some ways tremendously privileged. Yeah.
well, I don't say privileged in this way that like is like a battering ram or a weapon or like feel bad, put your head in shame. It's more like if you want to do something, like because I remember it was said in the context of like I want to help people and I want to do this, but what can I do? I'm just blah blah blah. And it was so the solution was so simple to me. It's like, okay, well, bring people here, or get, like, or just do a project with said people, like, what I mean, like, do
Yeah.
something, whatever, and then that little mysticism, that Cambridge mysticism that you have can now be attached to them, and now they can go do what they need to do and use it as a tool, not as like this, what I mean, like, because what I'm saying, this thing
Yeah.
means something to people who can like close or open doors, and so like
Yeah. You can call of it as like leveraging your privilege, like rather than just. I mean, we all have to check our privilege, be aware of it, be reflexive about it, and that's part of the issue that you're mentioning. But then also, we have to be thinking about ways in which we can creatively leverage our privilege to amplify the voices of people that otherwise might not be heard in particular spaces. So this is, for example, with the Kurdish movement. The Kurdish movement is brutally repressed, legally repressed. So one of the things that I've done on several occasions, including this academic delegation, but I've been involved in these peace delegations where we've gone with lawyers, with trade union activists, with European parliamentarians, with academics, including myself, into Turkey to try to get publicity, to try to engage in dialogue with the government, where people get thrown in jail. Turkish people, Kurdish people who are struggling are being thrown in jail, being brutally repressed. Trying to shed light on that, and knowing that it would be very costly for the government to touch us. So similarly, then going to the European institutions, lobbying at the Council of Europe, the Committee for the Prevention of Torture, trying to get the Committee for the Prevention of Torture to go visit Abdullah Öcalan to see he's held in conditions of totally inhumane conditions of almost total isolation, has been for many years, to try to intervene. And these are things that being someone from the University of Cambridge, when I speak to the representative of the CPT, they listen to me, and so I'm useful for the movement. Generally speaking, also when I go around, intervene in acts in Parliament or what have you, via act in Parliament, and have a guy from Cambridge to go and make the case that the Kurdish freedom movement is a freedom movement that's struggling against terrible oppression, and that to think about it as through the optic of the anti-terror legislation and the war on terror mentality is a problem. I can say things that the Kurdish people themselves, when they make those kinds of arguments, they put themselves in it's much more dangerous for them, given the legal framework, what have you. It would be costly for the British government to go after a university professor on anti-terror laws. So that's the basic intuition, is that when you're associated with these elite institutions, it's a little bit like being in the Middle Ages, being associated with the Vatican, something like this. So you become like the Bishop of Cambridge, so to speak. It gives you it gives you leverage that you can use.
Yeah.
There's limits to that, of course, but nonetheless, I think that if you're in a space like this, I think that and you don't come from a space like this, then I think you have a real responsibility to kind of open up this space and to use this space in subversive ways. And I think, to go back to the way that you were thinking about that kind of critique of the student politics, is that the struggle shouldn't be about being comfortable here. It should be about you shouldn't ever feel comfortable in a place like Cambridge, but you can use the power that you're sort of conferred upon by being associated with this place to try to speak truth to power.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I mean, so again, the whole, the issue of privilege checking. I think that it's important to understand, it's important not to talk about older people and stuff like that, but the politics of self-flagellation,
Yeah.
that doesn't do anybody any good. And so, what does do people good is to open the door. I mean, that's what does people good, and that's just oftentimes feel like the politics of self-flagellation are used instead of opening the door. You know what I'm saying?
Oh
Because
yeah.
it's safe to
Oh
self-flagellate.
yeah.
It's
Oh
safe
yeah.
to self-deprecate. It's safe to say, "Oh, look at me. I should feel so bad," and I do, as opposed to, "All right, I'm gonna open the door here and I might get fired." I mean, I might
Yeah.
get expelled. That is very different. And I don't know. And I really commend you for having that type of courage to
Well,
turn
yeah,
things.
that was definitely some of the most memorable experiences in the classroom that I have were around the time when you came out. And it was great when you came and talked about Trump the significance of Trump to the class there, and you and did some of your poetry. It was electric in there. Not everyone liked what I was doing in the classroom, bringing in people who normally aren't afforded the pulpit, the Cambridge pulpit. But nonetheless, I'm very happy that I did that, and I look for opportunities to kind of do those sorts of things in the future as well. Yeah.
Well, I mean, to this day, I really appreciate it. It's still the most, quote unquote, prestigious university I've spoken at. But I mean, what would be above Cam? I mean, there's only like two other ones.
Harvard. When I was at Yale, everyone spent a lot of time trying to convince me that actually Yale is at least as good as Harvard. When I came to Cambridge, same thing happened. That led me to be pretty sure that Harvard is the number one university, since everyone at Cambridge and everyone at Yale seemed to be so insistent upon being better than them.
maybe Cambridge Pepsi to Oxford's Coke and Harvard's Coca-Cola.
Yeah.
At this point, I don't care. I mean, no, I really do appreciate it. But at the same time, I was spoken at Occidental, UCLA, et cetera, that little tier down.
And don't underestimate the fact when you're at a place like Yale, and particularly when you're at a place like Cambridge, which has 800 years behind it. There's so much mediocrity here, so much mediocrity here. And the thing is, precisely because everyone just assumes that what happens at Cambridge must be really important, must be really serious. And so, whereas if you're at a place, at a public school, for example, you have to be great in order for people to recognize that you're great. Whereas here, with 800 years of reputation going for you, you could be miserable for 200 years before people catch on. So, yeah.
So what was interesting was when we had one of the students there, Christian. When we had Christian on, he mentioned that that the history of Cambridge is like shrouded in like criminality or something like that. I mean, like because like big criminal, shrouded in like direct criminality, like they were like these guys that were on the run from Oxford or something like that.
Well, there's that criminality, and then there's also obviously the implication in all of the British Empire that they have this movement which were exposed to a little bit, this decolonized movement, which is like, what are we going to do? We're going to like basically you have to blow the whole place up in order to decolonize this place.
Yeah. So, well, I don't want to get you in any more trouble than I already have. But I had my own run-ins with decolonized Cambridge. But anyways, getting back to Mafari. Tell us about Mafari. Tell us about how the work with, and tell us about Estella too. Tell us about Estella and where she plays into all this.
Well, Estella is the person. Estella Schmidt is someone who she comes from a background in sort of experimental theater, live theater, and things like this. She's Austrian, grew up in Vienna. She has lived in the UK since the 1970s, and from the 1980s, she got very active in the Kurdish movement. The networks of solidarity associated with the Kurdish movement. So I got on her radar when I was part of this academic delegation at Rojava, and since then she's really been very, very insistent, very energetic with respect to always making sure that to try to make sure that I continue to be implicated and do what I can. To write about the Kurdish question, to frame the Kurdish struggle for self-determination, engage with the movement, and to leverage my privilege with respect to the movement. She has been involved, and she does this. She's constantly trying to engage and create networks with people, and because she has a kind of artistic background, I think she kind of brings that creativity to her work as an activist, and is always trying to think about ways in which we can make connections and bring people together and do different kinds of to kind of organize creatively and be thinking about what the struggle for self-determination can mean in a creative way. She's the one who kind of influenced me to sort of take the work to take the message of the Kurdish struggle for self-determination, the rearticulation of self-determination as radical democracy, direct democracy, democracy against the state, what you have, to kind of wherever I go to talk about it. I found myself, because my wife, she comes from Tanzania. She's half Tanzanian, half Austrian, actually, but her mother comes from Tanzania. She's an epidemiologist, which no one ever knew what that word was until a couple months ago. Now everyone knows what an epidemiologist is. But anyhow, her work is based on public health in East Africa. So she spends a lot of time in East Africa. Like I said, her family lives in Moshi in Tanzania. So I end up spending more and more time out in East Africa. She was doing work based in Nairobi, and so I got interested in, when I was in Nairobi, look at what are the kind of movements on the ground, grassroots movements that are struggling for something like self-determination in the context of post-colonial Nairobi. I came across a group. Actually, I came across a group here at Cambridge. There was a guy who came. He came for a conference, and he's a grassroots activist at this place called the Mathare Social Justice Center. Mathare is one of the most densely populated ghettos in Nairobi. He told me, when you're out there, you got to come check it out. Maybe you can give a talk on the Kurdish movement. We're always interested in listening to what's going on in other movements. And these people are struggling on the ground in very dire post-colonial urban ghetto kind of context, a struggle against radical deprivation, systematic extrajudicial execution from very brutal police force, struggle for the access to clean water, to everything. Anyhow, very powerful, committed activists on the ground. And when I got involved there, kind of talking to them about how the Kurdish movement frames the struggle for self-determination, is interesting because Abdullah Öcalan, the leader of the Kurdish movement, was abducted actually in Nairobi in Kenya, and it was coming up on the 20th anniversary of that, and with a lot of people in the Mathare Social Justice Center, kind of organizing a kind of event in commemoration of the 20th anniversary of the abduction of Öcalan, kind of cross-fertilizing, so to speak, and always on the lookout for kind of interesting kind of creative stuff as well. I was very interested in there's all these in the urban milieu of Nairobi, the kind of reggae music and Rastafarianism has actually kind of really taken root in East Africa, really interesting ways. And some of these people are associated with the Mathare Social Justice Center. So I got involved, interested in kind of doing a kind of more creative project of thinking about the ways in which the music is involved in this, in the people associated with that kind of musical culture are involved in the struggle around the Social Justice Center, and have been kind of promoting links between the Kurdish movement and the struggle for social justice in Mathare, and also kind of trying to document the struggle of the struggle for self-determination as it's lived in the post-colonial situation in Nairobi. So that's my work with the Mathare Social Justice Center, this grassroots liberation project, trying so far, largely has been aspirational. It's been difficult the last year or so to really move forward with that project, but to try to kind of cross-fertilize not only the Kurdish movement, but also to try to get more people to kind of be aware of how the struggle for self-determination looks from that place, which is a different place from the Kurdish movement, because that's a place that achieved its self-determination, understood as they have a post-colonial state, but nonetheless, the situation is still one of radical and freedom.
Yeah, yeah. So that's an interesting thing to combine. But also tell us about the book that you put together.
The book, that was what I went to Mathare to go give a talk about. I've been giving the book is a book, Your Freedom and Mine, Abdullah Öcalan on the Kurdish question in Erdogan's Turkey, and that's a book that came out of some of these peace delegations that I was involved in. So after having gone to Rojava in December of 2014, I was recruited into the movement to be involved in more delegations, and in over the course of the first few months of 2015, there had been a peace process that was going on in the southeast of Turkey, which is the Kurdish region of Turkey. That the Kurdish movement's been involved in a armed conflict with the Turkish state since the 1980s, and Öcalan's been in prison since 2000. In 1999, he was abducted. And so for 20 years now, and there's been off and on peace negotiations or attempts to looking like there's going to be some sort of peace process. And between 2013 and 2015, there was a peace process going on. This kind of unraveled, and it unraveled. Actually, the siege on Kobani was a crucial moment in unraveling that peace process. But I was involved in these delegations that went. Actually, the delegation was originally spearheaded by a guy. It was a judge from South Africa, a guy by the name of Essa Musa, who was actually Nelson Mandela's lawyer back in the day. A really interesting person. He was the head of these delegations. I was involved. He ended up passing away shortly after his delegations, but nonetheless, there was a variety of trade union officials, European parliamentarians, intellectuals that were part of these peace delegations, and trying to kind of see if there was a way that we could pressure the European institutions to put pressure on the Turkish government to restart the peace process. And this was right as the region was the Kurdish region in Turkey was really descending into real total repression on the total war on the Kurds by the Turkish state. So to document, the book project was originally to document the work of these peace delegations and to kind of give a kind of historical context, but also give people voices, sort of edited volume to give people voices with respect to how they got implicated and involved in these peace delegations. And it kind of took on a life of its own. But yeah, that's the book. It's got a historical contextualization, and it's kind of trying to sort of at the same time to spread the word about the brutal repression that the Turkish state is exercising upon the Kurdish people. And this was happening in the southeast of Turkey, and since it's spilled over into Syria as well. And so sort of just kind of as part of the kind of consciousness raising about the importance of the Kurdish struggle and the plight of the Kurds. That's where that comes from.
Yeah. So can you tell us, we actually have a question from the audience. It says,
oh, yeah?
Are you familiar with Roger J.C. Young? I don't know. J.C. Young's Colonial Desire, a book on how radical democracy plays with decolonial thoughts from settlers' perspective.
What's the name of that book? That sounds like a great book.
Colonial Desire.
Colonial Desire. Write that down. No, Young. I'm not familiar with the book. No, but it sounds great.
Okay, well, that's what community is for.
Who's the author of that book?
Robert J.C. Young, I guess. Let me see. It says Roger, but I'm not sure if that's a typo or if that's the guy's name.
All right, cool. I can find it. The Colonial Desire.
Yeah, Robert J.C. Colonial Desire. So this has been a really great hour that we've spent together here. Jeff,
wow, an hour is gone, huh?
We are at 53 minutes and 13 seconds. So
right on.
About an hour. Can you tell us about? He's at Oxford. Robert J.C. Young.
Okay.
Oxford. Can you tell us a little bit about any future projects coming up? What's coming next, and how people can connect to it if they're interested?
Well, I'm always interested in struggles for self-determination. I think of if we think about the context that we're in a context where we have now 2 decades of this Orwellian war on terror going on. We have this unfolding climate catastrophe, and on top of this, now we have this global pandemic. The situation for with respect to the prospects of humanity and life on the planet even is quite dire. And so I'm interested in people who are struggling and resisting against this in this kind of apocalyptic scenario, struggling for a livable alternative. And thinking about the struggle for self-determination, wherever that struggle is situated, and thinking about the relationship. This was the idea behind the book being called Your Freedom and Mine, that it's not just a question of solidarity, but actually thinking about the Kurdish movement. The Kurdish movement has, in many respects, it's taken up a kind of revolutionary flame that's never been defeated. It's never been co-opted as a movement. It kind of continues this kind of this valiant struggle for self-determination. That's also why I'm interested in, for example, that similar kind of struggle taking place wherever it takes place. It's taking place in the ghettos of Nairobi. Watching people on the ground, just very impressed by the resilience, the capacity to resist. So people, I think, from a variety of different places in the world, have a different kind of vantage points of where this similar struggle, which is a struggle for a livable alternative to a very disastrous scenario that's unfolding in front of us. So anyone who's interested in those kind of dynamics of resistance to the war on terror, to the climate catastrophe, to the disaster capitalism that's accompanying this global pandemic. I'm interested in trying to see ways in which we could work together. So I kind of play like just like the work that I became interested in the Kurdish movement through a student of mine who got me involved in that, and from there, then I was bringing that kind of Kurdish message everywhere I go. I get engaged in this really fruitful dialogue with these people in Mathare who I come across. But I'm always interested in learning about other people's struggles and start figuring out ways in which we can maybe collaborate. So yeah,
Yeah.
so yeah.
Well, it's been a very fruitful conversation, and I look forward to many more. And I hope to see you soon in one capacity or another.
Yeah, man. Definitely. I mean, it's great to see that. Yeah, I mean, your energy and consistency and yeah, your voice is a really powerful voice. So I'm very happy to have had the opportunity to first get to know you online, then to get to know you in person, and hopefully we'll be able to continue figuring out ways to collaborate moving forward with Estella taking on her flame as well.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Thank you, Jeff. It's been a real pleasure.
Great. Thank you.